Hi, everybody. Welcome all. My name is Gregory Wilson. I am the author of Grayshade, the new dark fantasy, which is the first book of a trilogy from Athos Arts. And I'm also the IP lead for the Grayshade Kickstarter, which is currently running, which is designed to fund not only that trilogy of books and an audiobook, but also the 5e RPG known as Grayshade, set in the dark city of Corel. And I am joined by my good friend right over there, actually, Brandon O'Brien, who is a wonderful author and poet and game designer and is part of the core team on Grayshade, and has joined me today to talk a little bit about the classes within this game and the different classes you'll get a chance to play when we first get started. So, Brandon, let's talk classes, shall we?
Yes, please. Let's talk about these classes because I'm particularly excited about the new classes that are being introduced through the Grayshade RPG because I think that folks who are accustomed to playing 5e but are looking for a new experience in their RPG play would be particularly intrigued by the stuff that you have to offer.
Yep.
And of course, that means that we need to start with the class that is most indicative of Grayshade, the class that is technically literally on the cover, and that's the Acolyte.
Yes, the Acolyte, that's this one. The Acolyte is a fanatic religious assassin who is trained in stealth and combat and infiltration, very much along the lines of Assassin's Creed, if you're familiar with that game, or Thief, The Dark Project, which is definitely an influence in here as well. In the book, Grayshade is an Acolyte who has a bunch of things go wrong, and that's something you'll have to know when you actually read the book. But in the game, you can actually play an Acolyte and be one of those elite assassins who prowl the streets of Corel, who are expert in all of the things that I previously mentioned. Think lots of cloaks and dark blades in the night. That's really what the Acolyte's about.
Nice. Because obviously that's drawing on a lot of the energy that is already native to 5e, but I'm kind of curious in particular what mechanically does the Acolyte offer for players if they're looking for some new kind of engagement with 5e as a system?
So one of the things that the Acolyte is able to do, and this is somewhat outside the scope of our discussion immediately, but is to use a mechanic or a statistic, I should say, called faith, which actually informs what the Acolyte is able to do, particularly when they're confronted by psychological threats, attacks against them, which have an impact upon their mental fortitude. The Acolyte is particularly well trained in resisting this sort of thing because they have a very high faith stat. The negative side of that is that the high faith stat also means that they may be more susceptible to falling into positions of dogma, which means sometimes they may have difficulty adapting to certain kinds of psychological situations. Let's put it that way. So that's something which I think is unique in the D&D world. There's also a lot of the standard D&D roguish type of stuff that you might be able to see in terms of infiltration and combat and so forth. But it's important to recognize that these folks are supposed to be the ones that prepare extremely carefully, think blades in the dark here, very carefully before they actually engage in a mission. And so all of the preparation that goes into getting ready for those moments, that I think is kind of the unique flavor of this class that people will get as they're playing it.
Aha. I'm very intrigued to see how those things play out in particular because I do think, as we've spoken in other opportunities about discussing the Grayshade RPG, faith as a mechanic is very intriguing, and I'm very excited to see how that affects playing in a particular class and engaging with the decisions that you have there,
Yep.
especially because I do think that the Acolyte is very cool in terms of now you have a religiously inspired thief class or assassin class, which is very fun to play on. So, what kind of player do you think would really enjoy being an acolyte?
Well, I would say the different kinds of players who would enjoy this are A, someone who enjoys the extra work of planning. And I don't mean planning in a kind of let me do a spreadsheet. I mean thinking of all the ways in which one might plan, let's say, an assassination. Players, for example, who are familiar with the Hitman series of video games, where one of the things you have to think about is the route you're going to take to get to certain people, because the idea is not just to do the assassination or the mission. The idea is to do it without people necessarily knowing you were ever there. So if you are looking for someone who can kind of of get in and out of a situation without being noticed. That's the kind of thing I think would appeal to people. Also, and I mean, I don't know how technical the term this is, someone who kind of likes being a badass. I mean, the Acolytes are super good in combat. They are super good in, there's a lot of action beats within the story where there are battles between Acolytes. And one of the things that might remind you of is there's a lot of sort of brutal efficiency to it. Think combat within the Jason Bourne films, for example. And that kind of brutal efficiency is something which I think people may enjoy, in part because it feels like a very visceral sort of combat. If you are someone who is trying to avoid the possibility of assassination at all, maybe not the class for you, but if you're looking for someone where you're actually engaging in missions and where you have the potential over time to maybe question the missions you've been given, perhaps even turn back upon the people who gave you those missions, this is the kind of class for you.
Yeah, I think that sounds very exciting. I like it gives me a lot of person of interest vibes. Like
Yeah.
if you want to play Mr. Reese, but you're motivated by faith and not by the government, this sounds really neat.
Yep.
So I'm also very intrigued to hear more about the Informant, because that sounds like a kind of social play that is kind of new to 5e in a lot of ways, and I kind of want to hear more about what the narrative and mechanical goals of the Informant are.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the Informant, actually, as the class. So the Informant is a sly information broker who knows how to find what they need and how to profit from the finding. So the Informant's idea is basically to have a character that is able to gather information and is able to find out rumors and innuendo, but also to be able to separate the rumors and innuendo from the actual truth, to find out who is bribing whom, or who perhaps might be involved in certain illicit activities with other people and that sort of thing. Because the Informant is someone who is able to theoretically work for whoever is able to pay them enough. And that means that they live a very dangerous life where people can sometimes be angry or think that they are a threat to them. But if they're effective enough, then they can also be the types of characters that can end up becoming highly powerful because there is so much value placed on what different people are doing at different times. They are sort of freelance surveillists, I guess might be the term. And this is something which a lot of people actually were involved in, even in a lot of European Renaissance cities, like the one that I modeled Corel on, which is the Renaissance era Venice. Even in Venice, that idea of those who had information and could gather it and theoretically even sell it to others was a big deal. So I am a big fan of this because, as you say, this is not badass in terms of combat. It is very much, however, badass in terms of knowing what others do not know and knowing how to theoretically profit off of that knowledge.
Yeah, definitely. Like it the thing that I think I got the most from discovering that there is an Informant class is that it feels like the bard style of 5e, but instead of telling legends or singing old ballads, you are trading information. And it's the kind of thing that I think a lot of RPGs kind of sorely miss in that regard, because sometimes, like, this is exactly the kind of person that you need on your team. And as you say, like, a lot of history has hinged on this kind of engagement. So I'm kind of curious, like, how mechanically does this, like, differ from a lot of other social interactions in a lot of other games?
So one of the things that I want to mention about that is that there is a fairly robust, actually, social system that's built into D&D 5e, which nobody ever uses. And I think part of the reason for that is that people sort of imagine 5th edition and Dungeons and Dragons in general as having a particular kind of combat focus. But there are social mechanics in terms of the way that audiences are done with various people, and in terms of skill checks. A lot of skill checks, which actually is a holdover in some ways from 4e, a lot of these skill checks allow you to be able to determine different things. So the Informant places a great value on being able to determine truth from fiction. And so the Informant is very good at being able to develop their knowledge of insight to be able to understand, what actually is true and what isn't. But they also have to be exceedingly good at deception, right? Because they have to be able to tell people the truth that they want to tell them at the time they want to tell it. And there certainly may be cases and stories told where the informant may have in their interest not giving quite the right information to someone because they want to sort of manipulate things such that they'll get more money or more power or authority from someone else. As I said, this is an extremely dangerous game, so I would recommend high scores in charisma and paying a lot of attention to things like deception and the like. But having that ability to really read people is what the informant is good at. It's based on a character in the Grayshade novel called Rumor, whom everybody hates and no one can kill because he knows too much about everybody. So no one, everyone's like, I would slit that guy's throat, but if I do, I'm not going to find out what Baron such and so is doing on street X and such. And so having that ability to know that much is really powerful. And so being able to walk that tightrope is important. So it uses some of those already existing kind of social mechanics, but it also puts a real privilege on, in particular, insight and deception to be able to get things done.
Nice. I'm very excited to possibly play an informant very soon, because it does feel like it's for the kind of player who values a lot of social engagements but wants to get into the more nitty-gritty kinds of experiences of my life is at risk, the stakes are very high, I am not attempting to woo someone, I'm attempting to convince them that I am too valuable to harm. And I think that that's actually really intriguing.
And I should just quickly add to that, by the way, if you are the type of person who wants to play a character that is infused with the potential of hope, like it's a difficult place, but maybe there's a way, having someone to play an informant that actually tries to move things in a positive direction, given all of what we've just said about the danger of it, is really awesome. So the informant doesn't just have to be mercenary in nature, is my point there.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that playing it in that way is also a lot of fun as well. I have this information because I do not trust any of these people, and I want to find the ways in which to actually improve the place where I live. It's actually really neat.
Yep.
So, immediately following off of that, if you have an informant, it must stand to reason that there is someone lurking in the shadows whose job it is to gather information and try to use it to make their world better. And that obviously is always the Investigator. There is an Investigator class in the Grayshade RPG, and I'm very excited to hear more about that. So what can you share about this one?
Absolutely. I was very tempted to be like, I'm Batman, but no, it's not about Batman. It's just, it is an investigator who's off to the side. Yes, I actually really like this as well, partly because this captures the feel of the world so well. So the investigator is a perceptive public official who uses Corell's resources and their own intuition to solve crimes and keep the peace. They are essentially a city-paid investigator, or an inspector, if you will, or a detective. But the thing that I really like about this is that this is not someone who does things during the day in a suit and tie and then goes home to their family in the evenings. And right, this is someone who, to do what they need to do, has to prowl the dark streets of Corell, has to get information from seedy tavern owners, has to be able to catch criminals in the act, has to be able to unravel conspiracies that might be at the heart of this uneasy tension between the religious groups in Corell and the mercantile groups in Corell and the governmental groups in Corell. The investigator's job basically is to figure out what's happening so that one crime doesn't lead to multiple more crimes, and also needs to be able to do so in such a way that they make it stick, right? So the investigator really is that kind of a Sam Spade type, Dashiell Hammett, walking through the dark, rainy streets type of detective character. I also had a lot of Blade Runner vibes from this feel. Obviously, this isn't a bounty hunter per se, it's more of a detective inspector type, but the idea is the same, about having to get down and dirty with these people to be able to actually see what's necessary to find crime and to deal with the bureaucracy of government while you're dealing with it. And everyone always loves that, right? The films where you're always like, I'm done, turn in your badge, and then they're throwing all their weapons on the desk type of thing. This is also what they have to do, which is they're trying to keep the peace as best they can, and they're trying to do the good, theoretically, as best they can. But man, that gets difficult when it's 2 a.m. and you don't know exactly what alleyway that person snuck down that was, having just hit someone over the back of the head and taken their coin purse or something. Like, figuring out how to do that and being able to be part of that mix is, to me, very atmospheric, and I'm very excited for people to play that class.
Yeah, me too. Because it sounds like there is an obvious narrative and mechanical tension between essentially being a cop, being someone whose job it is to go out into the world and solve crimes and like keep the peace in your space, and knowing that even the officials who gave you the authority to do that are also not to be trusted, and that your job is to ensure that they're not corrupt and not using their power improperly as well. And I'm kind of curious, like, how mechanically that plays out to give that particularly unique feel of caring very much about actually keeping the peace in your city while also struggling with not only bureaucracy but with the levels of authority of other people who are trying to undermine your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, using in terms of sort of the more standard statistics, this is a character who will, in particular, do a whole lot of stuff with intelligence and perception. I'm sure that's not going to surprise anyone here, that there's a lot of emphasis placed upon being able to see and determine. But there's also a great deal of insight here. And I think one of the things that's sort of interesting about the way the investigator operates is that they are sort of a free agent at the same time that they work for the city, by which I mean the city has limited resources. So it empowers its investigators to go forth and to try to gather as much information to prevent crime and to actually stop those crimes as it possibly can. That doesn't make it like Judge Dredd level where they just, I am the law and they just kill people because they can. That's maybe more in the Acolytes wheelhouse theoretically. But it's very much the idea that they are able to follow where leads take them. And that sometimes means, first of all of the characters, I think even more than the Acolyte, the investigator probably gets to see the most of Corell, both above ground and underground. They get to go into different areas, different houses, different buildings, and be able to sort of see things that way. There is a premium certainly on stealth, and there's also a little bit of a combat focus on this one for those times when you just need to get into some fisticuffs with these criminals. So where the Acolyte is very combat oriented with some stealth and faith driven as well, while the Informant is very much more on the social side of things and tries to avoid conflict because, they can maybe try to get out of a fight occasionally, but that's, if you spend most of your time as an informant getting into a battle, it's not going to go well for you. The investigator, though, always has to be ready for these sorts of things, and so the investigator has to think about those things statistically as they're preparing their character. The other thing, though, that the investigator will be able to do, which is unique to them, is to be able to call upon certain city resources, which applies in two ways. Number one, the resources that they get from the city, so they're able to equip themselves for a cheaper amount than other characters might be able to do. And secondly, and can get those things replaced within reason if those things get broken in the midst of their work. And then the second thing is they can also sometimes call along basically an ally, a person who can jump on board with them and help them. Essentially calling in backup might be the way to do this. Now, this backup is limited in terms of how many times you can use it, but having a backup that allows you to, for example, I know such and so criminal is within this 10 block radius. I need you to go to the open heart alley because that's where I think they came in from or whatever. And then that you've got an ally there that will basically help you close this dragnet. And so the ability to call upon the city's resources, and again, sometimes those city resources will be removed from you, not just for story reasons, but because you've called on them too many times and they got a budget to deal with, that sort of thing is really interesting to me about the investigator also. So there's a little bit of they can fight when they need to. They have to be able to perceive and investigate and follow their intuition. They can explore a lot and occasionally can bring in allies to help them in this too.
Nice, cool. So what kind of play would you say is uh bound to like get the most out of the experience of playing the investigator?
That one's easy. Do you like Sherlock Holmes, which a certain friend of mine might have been using as a sound test before we began this video? Do you like Blade Runner? Do you like characters that are sort of combing the mean streets and trying to do the right thing in a world of darkness and allowing those little moments of light to kind of pop up here and there? Do you want to have that sense of the feel of the kind of dampness as you squelch along trying to get to the next person? And most of all, are you interested in seeing things that others won't see, the city below the level of the city, if you will, what's really going on behind the scenes? If you're interested in that kind of stuff and the idea of, again, unraveling conspiracies and not just taking what you see at face value, then the investigator is going to be a character for you.
Yeah. And I would also add, if you're into the kind of police procedural energy of playing a detective who knows that you're surrounded by corruption and iniquity and is genuinely determined to unravel that as well, to struggle against that kind of effort and still be triumphant, I think that this is definitely kind of experience for that in a fantasy setting, and I
Yeah.
think that that would be really neat. So another thing that obviously follows from setting your game in a world that is based on the history of Venice is, of course, there are always a lot of people with a lot of money and always very eager to spend it and make more of it. And of course, we're talking about merchants. There is a merchant class in Grayshade, and I definitely want to hear more about this because I think that this is mostly a new experience to 5e in particular in terms of class. So, what can you say about the merchant?
Yeah, why does a merchant always have to be an NPC, right? Like, why can't the merchant be someone that people actually play, where you're
Yeah.
trying to think about how to make money and how to be able to profit and tell good stories in the process of doing it? So, in Grayshade, the RPG, the merchant is a charming professional bargainer whose knowledge of trade and the limits of city regulations allows them to turn profit into power. So, a lot of what the merchant does is on the social level, but it's the social level with a difference. First of all, it is not designed to just sell and buy and sell information, but to buy and sell physical goods. In the Grayshade game, the merchant district is one of the major districts of the city, and the mercantile class itself is a group of people who wield enormous power within the city. And in some ways, they don't really care as much about what's happening religiously in terms of battles elsewhere, so long as they can somehow profit from it and the city doesn't erupt into open warfare, which is again bad for business. So the merchant gives you an opportunity to be able to negotiate with others, to be able to speak to others about ways in which to raise funds, to be able to trade items and so forth, to be able to even think about creating trade routes and the like. And the adventures that you go on here are about things like A, opening up regulations that make it easier for you to be able to do this kind of thing. B, being able to position yourself as someone who, because of your extra money and resources and your ability to get a good deal when you have one, to be able to think about things like hiring a couple of mercenaries to guard your front doors, or hiring a spy, let us say an informant, to be able to get information about your rivals, right? Or being able to speak to people like the Investigator about the work they might be doing with other potential criminals who could also be rivals for you in your mercantile business. So the merchant of all the classes is the one that has the most interaction with the other four. So I mentioned that the Investigator knows the most about the city. In a lot of ways, the merchant knows the most about the people, even more than the informant does in some ways, because while the informant is gathering information and buying and selling, the merchant is gathering and buying and selling everything, goods included. And so they have to think about those things. They also have to think about things that might involve moving outside the city. How am I going to be able to get trade into, me so that I can sell it to people here in the city? And how can I move it elsewhere? And what am I willing to do in terms of maybe shady deals that might put myself at risk or put my family or my city at risk? What am I willing to do so that I can turn an extra profit if by doing that I put myself at such risk that perhaps my life comes to an ignominious end and thus my ability to make any profit, right? So the merchant is always having to make these kinds of calculations, and this is a big part, I think, of what this class does within the game.
Hmm. So I'm getting the sense then that on a mechanical level, the merchant not only has a lot of access to a lot of money and physical resources, but can leverage those things in certain ways that other players, even with the best of social roles, can't possibly actually engage with. What do those things actually look like mechanically in the game?
So, one of the things that merchants, for example, are best at is being able to appraise the worth of other things. So, being able to determine whether something is actually valuable or is a bunch of junk, and whether they can maybe deceive people into thinking that junk is valuable. But that depends. But being able to appraise stuff is extremely important, right? Because being able to know whether something really is good or whether something is fraudulent is really important. And so the merchant has particularly high statistical skill and knowledge in intelligence from a D&D point of view. Obviously, they have to have a high intelligence to be able to do this. But there's also a high charisma associated with the merchant because they have to be able to, talk up a good game in the process of dealing with other people. But they also, therefore, therefore need to be able to assess people well. And so their ability to understand the motivations of other people, this gets back to insight, is something which the merchant is very good at, so that they are able to assess whether or not someone is being truthful to them or not being truthful to them, and what circumstances that works. I should also say that there are as well merchant guilds that exist within the city, and there is the possibility for storytelling of merchant characters being able to rise in the ranks of those guilds. But if you get a little too ambitious and a little too big for your britches and a little bit too much like, listen, ultimate monetary power, then you also could be brought low by other merchants within those guilds who are also equally capable of hiring informants to find out things about you, investigators to perhaps, maybe bribe an investigator to gather some information about you that you wouldn't otherwise know. It's claimed that one could never possibly bribe an acolyte, that they are unimpeachable, but I could see a story where perhaps such a thing could maybe happen in the course of role-playing events. But the idea is that you then become a target the more successful you are. So your particular ability as a merchant relates to your ability to buy and sell, appraise, trade, and understand goods, but also understand the routes that those goods take and how you would actually get them in and out of the city, and how you can create and develop those trade networks over time. So there's a lot of richness, I think, for role-play there with you and the GM.
And this definitely sounds like the kind of class that you play when you want to lean on some of the kind of secret observations about world building and social play in 5e, and like kind of pull strings behind the scenes to create advantageous situations whenever you need a certain resource or need a certain amount of money to accomplish a certain goal, or even just to leverage other characters in ways that are more effective than simply trying to talk them into something.
Right, especially economically, right? The benefit of being able to, of course, the informant can bribe as well, but can they bribe and also offer to set you up as a franchisee in the merchant district? That's something the merchants can do. So the economic manipulation is a big part of this. And by the way, you'll notice there's a trend there. The Acolyte gives you somewhat religious manipulation. The informant gives you literally manipulation of information. Who knows? Manipulation of knowledge. And now you have economic manipulation on the part of the merchant, and theoretically the investigator trying to figure out how this manipulation is happening with all of those groups.
And obviously, in the trend of manipulation, we now have to talk about the person who has perhaps the most
Yeah, you
power
saw where I was going with that.
Exactly. Someone who has a kind of capital that, again, is not very regularly explored in 5e as a class, and that is the noble, which is particularly interesting to me. What else can you say about the noble then?
Yeah, the noble is an elite diplomat who controls the levers of power by manipulating and persuading and intimidating others into doing what they want. But whereas the merchant does this with the use of money, and the informant does this with the use of knowledge, and the acolyte does this with the power of religious faith, the noble does this with the power of authority granted to them by their birth and by the status that they have achieved within the city. In the city-state of Venice, the Magnificos ruled over Venice not because of any particular economic advantage, although many of them did have economic benefits and so on. They ruled over the city because they wanted to be able to make it suitable for trade and to be very successful and rich as a consequence. And they were granted a certain amount of authority over others, including over those who might have, because of either religious inclination or economic inclination, believed they were better able to handle this. The noble here in Corel is the same idea, that the noble is able to understand who is part of the bureaucracy, who has to sign the permit to allow so-and-so to build the store on that given street, who is it that has to know how much crime actually took place in the residential district, and who was responsible for the 5 deaths that happened in Open Heart Alley. Maybe the investigator knows, maybe they told the noble, maybe the noble would like to tell you only 2/3 of the actual amount because it suits them, because they want to make sure that they have more control as they begin to move forward towards the highest ranks of position in Corel. The highest ranking official is actually the governor, and the governor is advised by a circle of 5 advisors. That advisor circle rotates because sometimes people are removed either deliberately or by complete accident. And so other people will enter
Accident, yes.
accident, yes, which the investigator may get a chance to investigate. But that circle is sort of the governor's closest advisory group. But it is really a larger consortium of merchants, of residents, and in particular of the religious orders as well, that essentially come together to nominate and then elect this governor. And so the governor is the titular head of Corel, but underneath that governor, there is this bureaucracy which is necessary to keep a large and prosperous city running. And that means that you've got city officials and you've got, various groups of not just the inspectors that we've talked about before or the investigators, but you've also got people who are officials that are designed to determine whether or not certain taxes are being collected. We always need tax collectors and things like that. And so the noble knows these people. The noble knows how all these people work. And the noble, because of their connections, either familial connections or because of their connections based upon long years of history with them, the nobles are therefore able to make those things happen. So if a merchant wants to, say, buy someone out and the noble finds out about it, okay, so you've bought someone out and you've bought out that minor official. That would be a problem if it weren't for the fact that, Lord Smithson over here is fully aware of what's happening with this because you've just told them, and they owe you a favor. And so Lord Smithson is going to take his own personal private army and shut down that current merchant that you're dealing with, right? So the noble's ability is to be able to use their own familial, ancestral, and in some cases just connections of longevity, if that's a thing, to be able to use that to manipulate the way that things happen around them. And again, nobles can be what the title says. They can be noble people, good people trying to do better, or they can be people who want to advance their own power and use their resources and influence to be able to do exactly that. One point, though, nobles therefore can also be targets. So be thinking about that if you're thinking about wanting to take on that role.
So this definitely sounds like the kind of role that you play when you want to pull political strings and influence things like legislation and the engagements of other people with authority and power in certain kinds of high-scale situations, high-stakes situations, where like just being successful in convincing someone to do something is not enough. You need to actually in a lot of ways intimidate them beyond your own physical engagement. You need to leverage things that are bigger than you, and I think that that's particularly interesting as well. What do you think this will offer mechanically to players?
So one of the things that is going to be important for this, there is, of course, charisma that is associated with this. But one of the things this actually, I think, does mechanically is it puts a premium on not so much combat, although I guess there are moments where that could come into play, but it really puts a premium into the ability to organize and put together in your own mind what you want to accomplish. In fact, I think of all the classes, the noble is the one where the end goal is the most open-ended in a way. It's not that the goals of the others are super constrained. You can do different things with all of them. But I think the real benefit of the noble is mechanically you have a high intelligence and wisdom and a pretty solid charisma so that you can actually see through, when people are telling you other things. But you also need to be able to know when to be able to drop the gloves, metaphorically speaking, and be like, listen, I'm going to impose this tariff on such and so district because I can do that. And if you don't like that, then I'm going to let people know about the fact that you fathered 2 illegitimate children with harlots in this district last year. And then, right? And this is information you gathered because you hired an informant, but it's also information you knew to try to gather because you knew the person in the first place, because you grew up at the same fencing school and you were, given the same elite training at the academy where you learned all of this high-level scientific and other information, and you knew what your classmates were like in this elite kind of, only for noble sort of group. And so there's going to be mechanically very much an emphasis on being able to decide when to use the various skills and abilities that you possess. Certainly persuasion and deception come into play here as well. Certainly insight comes in here as well. But the noble needs to be thinking about not just the skills they have, but when to deploy them. And again, discipline is hugely important. Nobles can have a high faith faith score. And when they have a high faith score, that will actually help their ability to maintain their discipline, because if they react emotionally, or they jump to conclusions, or they fly off the handle, or they get overly drunk one night and say things they shouldn't, that can result in the end of their own power. So they need to be able to think about when and how to deploy the skills they have. So thinking of a broad-based kind of class structure, I think, is important for people who want to take this on.
Yeah, definitely. Because this sounds in a lot of ways like, uh, have you ever wanted to play a Medici in 5e? But
Exactly right.
also,
Yep.
but also in a lot of ways is kind of, do you want to play the kind of person who has grown up in wealth and power and discovered ways that you can use it for good, or even ways, particularly interesting ways that you can use it for evil, by pulling on the strings of the world around you rather than simply pressing on individual charismatic engagements with one or two people. And I
And
think that that would be particularly interesting in play.
absolutely. And I wanted to just quickly add to that, that from a group point of view, this also makes it interesting when the noble is playing with some of these other classes, right? Because the noble has to think about certain other large picture macro ideas. Imagine a party where an investigator says, but I know what's involved. We figured out the crime. We had our informant gathered information that we needed, and I managed to figure this, that, and the other, and the merchant bribed people and whatever. So now as the investigator, I've got this information. And the noble player at that point can be like, that's great, but if we let that information out, there will be open warfare on the streets, because this lord being involved with that particular crime means that all of a sudden the church has gotten, the Order of Argoth, let's say, has gotten directly involved with this noble, and that's going to cause all sorts of issues. And I do want to point out that Grayshade is a game ultimately where I do want people to think about working collectively here, but they have to work collectively with a variety of roles. And so the noble can give you lots of benefits, but it also means that the noble has a macro view that sometimes some of the other characters, the merchant, the informant even, have more of a micro view, and that means they really need to work together to get things done, and that can provide really interesting tensions, I think, within roleplay.
Definitely. And especially given a lot of the ways that mechanically this game kind of reinforces the idea that the world is constantly acting against you as well. That you're not just on an adventure where your decisions just suddenly reap the immediate repercussions for you, but there are also lasting effects that will have consequences, not only for decisions that you make 3 or 4 sessions into Defeated that you hadn't even thought about yet, but for other people that you may not meet until you witness those repercussions take place in their lives. And I think that all of these classes have ways in which their engagement is not only about how do I get the thing that I need now, but how will this affect me and the people around me near the end game of a campaign and stuff like that, which I think is really interesting.
Absolutely. You're shaping the people you're with and the city you're in. And I think that's as exciting as it gets. Again, that reminds me, I certainly thought about Blades in the Dark when making this, and about how places like Dunwall are shaped by the people that live within it as surely as the city shapes them. And of course, that's the case with any large city, even now up until the modern day. But the idea that people really can have that influence, I think, is very exciting and gives people a sense that they are continually molding the world as they are being molded by it. And that kind of environment, character interaction, I think, is a ton of fun. As you could tell, I'm very excited about this, so it's going to be great.
I'm excited too. I dig the idea of playing a band of heroes whose goal is not just to have an adventure and then go home knowing that they've had an adventure, but to actually engage in what is essentially the history of Corel and have a part in actually changing it for the better or for the worse in ways that are obvious to anyone who is experiencing it, even if you're experiencing it as someone simply watching that story play out. And I think that that's particularly going to be a lot of fun for a lot of people. And of course, that's not it. Of course, there is still more yet to reveal about the Grayshade RPG, because we are still quite a ways away from our next backer goal, which will give us the opportunity to add a new class to the Grayshade RPG. And that's still presently secret. If I'm not mistaken, folks will even have an opportunity to engage in a bit of democracy to determine what class that might be.
I mean, like, what game would not be would be complete without the possibility to create democracy? Yes, that's exactly right. When we get to 200 backers, and as I speak, we are currently at 162, but we've picked up a number of backers today, actually. When we get to 200 backers, we are going to have a bonus class revealed, but that bonus class will be a choice of 3. Now, I'm keeping those 3 secret at the moment, but we do have a basic idea of what those 3 are going to be, and the backers will have a chance at that point to vote on which of the 3 they would like to see rolled out next, and which one they'd like to see as an actual class available. Now, who knows? Maybe other stretch goals down the line might provide other opportunities for other classes, but we're definitely going to have at least one starting out bonus class once we hit that 200 backer level. So I'm very excited about that, because obviously there are many other possibilities that I can think of in terms of possible character classes that will just enrich Corel. And one of the nice things about this game is that it doesn't have to be fully symmetrical, right? You don't need to have a character that does everything. You need to have a character that does the thing that it wants to do really well, and that character can really develop into being a character which works with others. Now, there is a way that the characters can sometimes be very individualized in terms of the way they do missions on that micro level, but as the game continues and as one develops, the picture automatically becomes a little wider, and you encounter more people that think differently from you, and that is going to create all kinds of different opportunities for different kinds of classes to be involved in the mix. So we got big plans, is what we're saying, and when we hit 200 backers, you will get to see the first example of one of the expansions of those plans. But I think these 5 classes we talked about are awesome to begin with. I'm just excited for the bonus stuff that we get down the line.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like these five classes in and of themselves are very meaty, which is why I'm gonna end with one absolutely very silly question, just to get people's brain percolating. And I hope that I catch you off guard with this question as well.
I'm ready. Can confirm. I'm ready.
A character, you get to figure out which character this is from the last television show that you watched. Is a class in is one of these 5 classes that you've just revealed. Which character and which class?
I got it. Last show that I watched was the last episode of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Should watch, by the way. It is really good. And the character that I'm thinking of is the Grand Inquisitor. And the Grand Inquisitor, for those of you who watched, whose job it is to track down Jedi, I know that's terrible and awful. I love Kenobi, but I'm just saying that guy is very much himself an investigator of sorts. He is an investigator, of course, for terrible reasons and for ill ends, and I don't want you to think that that's the only way to play. In fact, I expect the investigator is probably going to try to do the right thing more than the wrong thing. But the point is, the investigator not only is badass in combat, but the investigator also has a nose for when people, whether it's people within his own faction of Inquisitors or whether it's others, are telling him lies or maybe trying to deceive him, and always seems to end up eventually in the right place at the right time. So the Grand Inquisitor, investigator, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Let's go. That's what I'm thinking about.
Nice. I want to say I love that answer, and I want to say this is the part where I turn to the camera and go, so if you ever wanted to play the Grand Inquisitor, but you don't want to play the Grand Inquisitor, I'm sure. But
we can't afford the licensing, really, is really what it comes down.
But I mean, that is enough to like confirm that there is like a lot of richness in these classes that I think that people are going to enjoy a lot, especially playing on the edges of whether they are good or bad, or whether the decisions you make as any one of these classes are innately noble or innately ignoble. I think is going to be a lot of fun. Those are things that you get to play with if you help us get to our goals in the Grayshade Kickstarter, so we can make this RPG a reality. You get to play these cool things. Whether in Corel or in any other city that you're playing a 5e game in, hint, hint, nudge, nudge. But I think that would be a lot of fun. Please support the Grayshade Kickstarter so we can give these things to you, including that 6th class that I'm very excited to discover what it is. And Greg, thank you so very much for sharing so many cool tidbits about these classes with me.
Oh, well, thank you, Brandon, so much as always. And if you want to see more of Brandon's work, you should check out Brandon's work with Sound Clash, The Clampdown, and many other game design works on his itch.io page, or find him over as part of our Grayshade core team. And you can find us over on the Kickstarter, which is kickstarter.com/projects/alligatoralleyent. Grayshade, GRAYSHADE. Link will be as well available in descriptions and elsewhere. Thank you, everybody. We've got about 9 days left to go, so please go over, back pledge, let people know, and thank you all for watching. I can't wait to play in Corel with all of you soon. Bye for now.